Hi, Mom. So I got my ticket home from Europe. I get back on June 6th, but it's a really late flight because that was the cheapest, so it gets in at midnight. But don't worry, I'll get a shuttle from the airport so you don't have to pick me up. Like, really seriously, you don't have to. Okay, so, love you. See you soon. Bye.
On the 15th of August 2013, the Fulbright Company, a Portland, Oregon-based indie game developer, released their first video game for Windows, Mac, and Linux entitled Gone Home, a first-person adventure game. The game puts you in the shoes of Katie Greenbrier, a 21-year-old girl having gone home late one night during a severe storm after spending her sophomore year of college abroad in Europe. Her family's new home in fictional Boone County, Oregon, was an inheritance from Katie's grand uncle, Oscar Manson. Upon arriving at the front porch and finding a key to the front door to enter the house, Katie finds that the house is empty and that no one is there to let her know where her family is, apart from her younger sister Samantha having left a note on the front door imploring her older sister not to go looking for her, which Katie ignores. What follows is Katie exploring all around the house, every room, every shelf, every closet, even every secret passageway, to find out what happened to Samantha and her parents during this stormy night. Prior to the 2013 release of Gone Home, the founders of the Fulbright Company, Steve Gaynor, Jonaman Nordhagen, and Carla Zymanjah, were involved in the development of the BioShock 2 DLC Minerva's Den, which, while maintaining the gameplay mechanics of BioShock 2 and putting the gamer in the shoes of a Big Daddy's first-person perspective, to some gamers, Minerva's Den is considered superior in story compared to BioShock 2's story, and echoes of Minerva's Den's influence on Gone Home can be seen all around the game. Despite having a lesser budget than BioShock games, Gone Home was a critical and commercial success, with Metacritic scores in the high 80s for each respective gaming console the game was ported to, and 50,000 copies sold a month after its release, and 700,000 copies sold in total 4 years after its release. Today, Gone Home is often cited as not only an achievement in indie game development, but is called an example of the success and evolution of walking simulators, with one retrospective article from Polygon calling Gone Home one of the most important games of the decade, along with Fortnite and Minecraft, that decade being the 2010s. But 10 years after its release, and after all the commercial sales and critical acclaim, does Gone Home still hold up? Hello everyone. Today I want to try something different and do a retrospective critique and analysis of the 2013 indie game Gone Home. However, this critique and analysis is not just directed towards addressing the flaws and shortcomings of the game, but it will also be addressing and criticizing yours truly. Yes, I am in fact critiquing myself here today, specifically an early 2017 short video I did on a now deleted YouTube channel with, yes, this title, Gone Home Sucks, in 90 seconds or less. Although there are points that, even 10 years after playing the game, that I kind of agree with, the presentation of the arguments as well as the style of my original review is, in my opinion, not presented in the best light possible, and to be frank, disingenuously on my part, and doesn't reflect how I really feel about Gone Home today, with the passing of time, as most of the review was coming from a reactionary, clickbaity, and quite frankly, cringy place. But that being said, while I have loosened up my opinion on the game as a whole, 10 years after its release, and I would say my opinion is more curious, mindful, observant, and less reactionary compared to years before, and I do agree that the game has a few redeeming qualities, I still think that Gone Home has a few issues, which I want to discuss and dissect here. So in this video essay, we'll be discussing the story, game mechanics, and conclusion of Gone Home, and see what the game does right and where it mostly falls short. Mainly the story and family conflict not being as compelling as one might think, despite the game's positive reception given its LGBTQ+ themes. I have chosen to criticize my own thoughts from years ago first, as a gateway to getting into the meat and heart of the game's story, as we'll be exploring the lore and plot by diving into its chapters for each of the game's characters, starting with the playable character Katie, the girls' parents Janet and Terry, and finally Samantha. The reason I am doing this essay in this fashion is because if you played the game before without doing the super secret shortcut route, which we can get to, there is a bit of linearity with Gone Home's story and plot, and how you, as Katie the explorer of the empty house, drive the game's plot, and how by exploring the house in a somewhat orderly fashion, you learn more about the characters and how they ended up as they are. Usually when I criticize the flaws and nitpicks of a particular game or piece of media, even a game which I contend is great, I try to balance the scales a bit with a chapter in each essay called On the Other Hand. However, since this essay will be leading towards the mixed and negative side, consider this essay one big extended On the Other Hand chapter, with an elephant in the room chapter replacing where the On the Other Hand chapter would go before the essay's conclusion. And this should go without saying, this video essay will contain spoilers for Gone Home, as well as other games like Myst, The Seventh Guest, Return to Zork, Bioshock, and the Minerva's Den DLC from Bioshock 2, and we'll assume you've played Gone Home at least once. Anyway, let's begin. As I said in the introduction, this section will begin the retrospective review of Gone Home by criticizing my own short video from 2017, which I based upon playing the game at least twice, one playing the full game for 2 hours and one where I took the speedrunner route, or just shortcut or cheat, and got to the ending within a minute. But just a fair warning, the video you're about to watch is extremely cringe, especially for me to have to watch along.
Gone Home sucks.
In 90 seconds or less.
See what I mean when I say this wasn't going to be easy for me to revisit? Well, this is just a small taste of what's to come. Anyway. The title of this game is misleading. In fact, the game should really be called, Hey sis, I'm a lesbian and I'm not home, but I left you a journal for me to voice over throughout the 2 hours players play this bollocks. Yeah, so if we're trying to be technically correct here, the person who has quote-unquote gone home is the POV playable character Katie, and the one who has gone away from home is Samantha, Katie's younger sister. So the game's title itself isn't misleading, but to be fair, and this will come up again here and there, I do think that the game's spooky haunted house aesthetic, especially the game's cover art, is misleading, but that would require a much more thorough explanation, and a possibly better retort to that explanation. As far as the details of Samantha's journal and how it plays a part in driving the game's story, we'll come back to that. It's boring as all hell. In fact, it's so boring you have to wonder why critics gave this game high praise and accolades, and yet gamers were divided over this experience. Okay, so from what I can gather from revisiting the game and then rewatching this short, review, clearly my half a decade ago brain didn't have as much of an appreciation and respect for indie game development as it does now with the passing of time and experience, as well as understanding that going into a particular indie game that, unlike a big budget AAA game, there is the possibility that there will be some limitations and compromises in the development of said game. A casual gamer who is used to playing first-person shooters like Bioshock, or even mass blockbuster games like the Call of Duty or Halo games, shouldn't go into a game like Gone Home with the expectation that they will be getting a gun-ho roller coaster ride. Despite there being multiple times in the Bioshock series, just like Gone Home, in which a player, say Jack, Subject Delta, Booker DeWitt, and especially Subject Sigma at the end of Minerva's Den, is just walking around, even if these games aren't classified as walking simulators, which we can debate on what qualifies as such and what doesn't. But as far as the critical versus general audience reception to Gone Home, well, again, we can dissect that later. While I don't doubt the writer's sincerity in telling the story, Gone Home can't help but recycle cliches and traits from other works we've all seen before. Case in point, the fictional conspiracy theorist father being a failed writer bordering on alcoholism who may have been molested, the mother having an affair with someone at work, and the main character's sister learning to accept being a lesbian while having a relationship with a riot girl. Essentially, it's American Beauty meets Stephen King meets Lifetime Channel. Okay, so a lot of what I have to say about the character of Terry, the father of Katie and Samantha, and his backstory will be explained in his chapter, but the trope of an alcoholic father struggling with a severe case of writer's block isn't anything new, and Terry's tragic past, which may or may not have shaped his failed novel writing career, is worth diving into. But again, describing Gone Home as being American Beauty meets Stephen King meets Lifetime Channel, really? I mean, I know I'm arguing with my past self, and I might agree in part on the Stephen King part, as his bibliography and film adaptations do contain alcoholic writers in his work. Never mind King's own history and success overcoming alcoholism, but the rest of that description is just disingenuous. To be fair, the visuals and main theme playing throughout the game are just fine, but it's the sort of song I would imagine playing in something more dramatic. Maybe even a ghost story, which this game teases with but isn't there. That would have been more interesting. Now, of all the reasons I have given for having such a negative opinion of the game at the time, reason number 4 is probably the one I stand by the most, not simply because it's the most generous of the 5, but because 10 years after its release, I can honestly say that not only do the visuals hold up, especially considering the limitations of indie game development, but because, well, the more I played this game as I was revisiting it recently, the more I can say the soundtrack by Chris Remo sounds better with each gameplay. Even those Riot Girl music cassette tapes you find around the house are appropriate given Samantha's character development, but that will be explored in her chapter. Let's all be honest here. There are infinitely better, more exciting games like this that are better than this. Okay, so like the Seventh Guest, Myst, and Return to Zork were more fulfilling experiences, but like these games were part of my childhood when I was growing up in the 90s, so of course I was gonna have some level of bias towards them. I'll dive into the legacy of an influence that Gone Home has left towards indie game development in a moment, but just to be clear, while Gone Home might have its issues, part of the reason Gone Home even exists in the first place is because of what came before it, and thanks to Gone Home, there probably have been better, more fulfilling gaming experiences in indie gaming, especially walking simulators. Good thing I got this game for free last November, because I would never pay $20 to waste 2 hours with an easily predictable conclusion waiting. And what a letdown this really was. Did I forget to mention that there was a bonus reason in that video? Yeah, I think I did. Anyway, I actually did buy a copy of the game through my Steam account to revisit this game, along with the game's original soundtrack by Chris Remo, which you may have caught if you're paying attention to the background music during the introduction of this essay. But my original review was done after I had downloaded a free copy of the game distributed on Fulbright's own website. I even bought a copy for my Nintendo Switch, but whatever you may think of the quality of a game itself, is pretty generous for a developer, especially one with an economic disadvantage like an indie game developer, would feel confident and rewarding to gamers to put out a game for free, even for a short while. But now that we've dived into that hellfire of a video from way back when, it is time for the actual retrospective and analysis of Gone Home, starting with a few nice words. Despite the mostly mixed and negative feelings I have about the game 10 years after its release, I do have a few positive remarks I want to say about the overall gaming experience of Gone Home. Firstly, the way the Greenbrier house is laid out when looking at the map by pressing the M key on your keyboard makes you think you are looking at the layout of a real mansion. Not only that, but since 99% of the interactive gameplay between the player and the environment takes place in the house, the player is given hundreds of household items to pick up and examine, which is a great similarity between this game and its ancestor BioShock, especially the original if you're using the telekinesis plasmid without throwing objects. Of course, in BioShock, there's a bigger conflict boiling under the sea in Rapture, where you're in the shoes of Jack, but putting that game's central conflict aside, even in a failed utopia setting like Rapture, there's literally hundreds of cigarette boxes, photographs, posters, and other items and sites to examine, which makes Rapture a place you want to revisit again and again in case you missed anything. This is also true for BioShock's ancestors, System Shock 2, where there's a gazillion items all around the Von Braun and Rickenbacker with detailed item descriptions for gamers to read while ducking from the many. Likewise, this was the case after my first replay of Gone Home, and then hearing the commentary tracks from the development team at Fulbright, among others, where they explained the origin for certain household items or belongings. I appreciate that a game development team, even one as small as Fulbright, took the time to really paint a portrait of this home, spread out every appropriate piece of furniture, postcard, book, VHS tape, and everything else in their proper location. And when you actually step into the house after finding the front door key and turning on the lights, at first glance, it really does feel like you're walking into a pleasant getaway in the Pacific Northwest. Speaking of which, since this is taking place in the Pacific Northwest, not only should the Chris Remo soundtrack be commended, but some of the non-original soundtrack choices are appropriate to listen to when you, as Katie, are putting some of the cassette tapes in the cassette players all around the house, in contrast to the ambient, sometimes Twin Peaks-esque original soundtrack by Remo, resulting in a subdued melody, where most of the songs correspond to their appropriate journal entry. The song choices from other artists, featuring Heavens to Betsy, Bratmobile, and the Youngins, are in relation to Samantha's character development while Katie is away in Europe. Mainly, the songs are in the Riot Girls subgenre of rock music, as Samantha is learning more about herself. I could go on to dissect what each song means, but that would end up being another tangent. Well, actually, I'll come back to the final song choice towards the end credits. Lastly, praise must be made towards the voice acting, especially from voice actress Sarah Grayson, who voices Samantha in all of her journal entries, which you can find around the house. As you are learning more about what happened to Samantha and her family in the time between Katie being away from home to arriving to the empty house, you are able to hear Samantha at her happiest moments and her feelings of loneliness, lovingness, heartbreak, and anger in all of the 23 entries. Of course, the voice acting comes with a downside, but we can get to that in the character chapters. So while there are a few nitpicks here and there like with any other game, such as why don't the commentary track symbols disappear after I pressed on them to play, and like go into my menu like Samantha's journal entries if I have commentary tracks turned on before playing, overall, even though I can't take back my initial review fully, I can honestly say that I came out of my recent gaming experience with Gone Home with a new appreciation and respect for the amount of work that went into creating the house and the development of the Greenbrier family. But unfortunately, while I have acknowledged plenty of redeeming qualities that this game delivered, the biggest problem this game has is the scope of the story and how it limits both the difficulty of the game and the universe itself. Let me demonstrate by explaining the objectives of this game, without giving too much away regarding the story and family conflict. You are trying to find some way to get to the attic upstairs, which is locked and no one is allowed in there when the red lights are on, and all of this involves finding a secret hidden door in the parents' closet, where you'll walk through this creepy newspaper wall covered secret pathway back downstairs, and where there's a hand-drawn mini-map showing 3 secret compartments all around the house, and 2 of them contain the combination to Sam's locker in her bedroom upstairs, which contains a key to get into the basement, which is the only way to get into the east wing of the first floor, and after you happen to find the greenhouse in said wing, you realize there's a secret room right in the main hallway of the house all along, which holds the key to the attic that takes you up there. Thus concludes the game of Gone Home. That's essentially the bare bones description of what the gamer has to do to complete Gone Home without taking the story and plot into account. And yes, for you impatient speedrunners who don't like exploration and or are already biased enough to not really take the time to dive deep into the house and see what the development team worked on, I just gave away the secret 1 minute or less route to completing this game, which I did after I played this game in 2 hours or so, while writing the script. However, even with the skeleton of the game's interactivity accounted for and explained, even a seemingly mediocre game with a relatively easy objective list can make up for gameplay faults by having a compelling story that the player has to unravel and discover, right? Well, sadly, that's not the case with Gone Home, and this is the main reason why Gone Home, despite its influence, has dragged in the years after its release, compared to what has come after it. To put it bluntly, the game's story itself, and to an effect, the game's world after playing it a few times, feels too small and condensed. Mainly the focus on Samantha's self-discovery and realization of her same-sex attraction towards other women, how some of this may have had its roots early in her childhood, and her parents' negative reaction to a growing relationship with her new friend turned partner Yolanda Londi de Soto, in which she fears what could happen if her parents find out she's a lesbian. A common theme with past reviews of Gone Home was the critical reception towards the game's LGBTQ+ themes, since stories of same-sex relationships and LGBTQ+ characters, while becoming more commonplace in gaming as years went on, was either mostly taking place in indie gaming and or when existing in a game, limited in scope. Sure, you could have romantic same-sex relationships in, say, The Sims, or see gay or lesbian characters like Sandra Cohen in BioShock, or in games like The Longest Journey or The Last Express, but they weren't front and center in these games, mostly relegated to the background. And sure, we have to assume Katie isn't on the LGBTQ spectrum, since her father joked about her bringing boys home, as we learn in one of Sam's journal entries, but I think the focus on the development of the relationship between Sam and Lonnie is what got marginalized gamers hooked onto Gone Home, and what landed the game plenty of praise from the gaming press. That said though, regardless of what gaming publications said a decade ago, today, no matter how you go about the house to get to the attic, you cannot change anything about the events of what has happened to the characters not in the house, because of the singular ending in this game, and quite possibly the most optimistic outcome this game could have had, which we'll get into. You, as Katie, are just an observer, a sort of armchair Greenbrier family historian, as to what transpired before going back home. There is, however, a defense of focusing on this one same-sex relationship I could possibly think of in Gone Home, even with narrowing the scope of the story. Let me explain by considering the setting and timing where and when, respectively, Gone Home takes place. The game is taking place in the seemingly liberal state of Oregon, specifically Boone County, which is the fictional placeholder for Tillamook County, Oregon. But since that county doesn't immediately jump out as ultra-red conservative, at least when you look at the last presidential election results compared to the rest of the state, well then, it's simply a matter of time. In 1996, a year after the fictional events of Gone Home would have taken place if real, not only had we learned more about AIDS and HIV and realized that with the development of drugs and science for treatment of HIV, and after years of the Reagan administration and homophobic bigot scapegoating of gay men did not hold up well, as AIDS doesn't discriminate so long as you're having unprotected sex, but the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA, was passed by the Democratic Bill Clinton presidential administration, banning the federal recognition of same-sex marriage, recognizing the union of marriage as between one man and one woman, and allowing states to ban gay marriage. Now, supposedly, the reason why President Bill Clinton signed DOMA was because it was a compromise to passing an outright ban on gay marriage by the Supreme Court. But in hindsight, it just seemed like caving into the increasingly more socially conservative Republican Party after they won the House the previous year. And even today, even as the Supreme Court of the United States ruled DOMA unconstitutional years ago, and same-sex marriage was legalized, albeit after another example of incrementalism thanks to neoliberalism, LGBTQ+ rights are still under attack, even by a more conservative and blatantly financially corrupt Supreme Court. Whether it's attacks on transgender rights and transgender healthcare, especially in states like Florida, or even with small businesses being granted the right to not provide gay couples services like, say, a wedding cake, the incremental progress made on these social issues have degraded in large part due to a disingenuous and bigoted culture war started by the conservative right as a reaction to legislative accomplishments on LGBTQ+ rights. I know I'm summarizing the issue in part, but to be fair to the game, it's easy to see why Gone Home's story wouldn't work in, say, the second term of the Obama administration as opposed to the mid-90s. Although, if Gone Home were to be done today, you have to wonder if it were to involve, say, hypothetically, a person discovering they're trans, if the reactionary backlash from certain gamers would have been more intolerant, which is a point which we'll come back to when we discuss the critical versus general audience response a year after its release. Now, with all of this history noted and commentary said, it is now time to talk about the real meat of the world of Gone Home, mainly the Greenbrier family, starting with the game's only playable character. Caitlin Greenbrier, or Katie for short, is the first main character introduced in Gone Home, with the opening voicemail of Katie calling her mom and telling her she will be arriving home soon from a European trip, which unfortunately, apart from hearing the voicemail again when you're replaying the messaging machine near the west wing of the house, is the only dialogue she has in the entire game. The biggest problem here is that Katie feels less like a fully fleshed out character, with thoughts, feelings, and emotions, and more like a walking observer. Someone who can't change what has happened during or after the events of the game. That doesn't mean we don't learn anything new about her, as we do see that Katie was a track star if you look at the trophies to the right of the main hallway next to the locked door of the east wing of the house. And sidebar, I'm not even sure if that was an in-joke from the production team behind the game because of the fact that there's no run option, but that was high school, years after the events of the game and not relevant to the story happening now. We can also assume, based on how all of Sam's journal entries are addressed to Katie, even as she is away in Europe, that she can trust her older sister to reveal her secrets, her relationship with Lonnie, and how Sam struggles to come out to her parents. But besides getting Sam a present at the Shakespeare Book Company in Paris, according to one of the postcards you find sent by Katie early in the game, Katie herself, despite being the one you're supposed to interact with in the game's universe, can't interact in the relationships between the other three characters to change or affect the game's events, nor does she have any reaction to what she's learned about Sam as we get to the game's conclusion. And sure, we learned that Katie's sophomore year in Europe, she spent time in Paris, France, Italy and the Vatican, Barcelona, Spain, London, Brussels, and Amsterdam, but even the aforementioned postcards you find around the house don't really say much about how Katie is feeling apart from reaffirming that she loves her whole family, and it feels more like filler for gamers to find and examine. To put it another way, Katie is more like Jack in the original BioShock, a mostly blank slate despite his importance in that game's universe and story, in which he drives the plot by his actions and continuing exploration of Rapture. Likewise, Katie drives the plot by exploring the whereabouts and mystery of Samantha during the storm, as well as looking around the house to see the situation involving her parents' crumbling marriage. But again, she doesn't really share any reaction or input as to what she's learned or has witnessed, apart from the occasional pop-up text, like, "You did in fact hire a voice actor to read out the opening voicemail, so why not let her say more?" Sometimes though, it's not always the case that Katie is just there to move events towards the conclusion of the game, and she does have some feelings about what she finds around the house and or Sam shares with her, and maybe we the audience are meant to fill in the blanks as to how Katie would react in such a situation. Case in point, Katie searching through her parents' bedroom and finding a condom wrapper in one of Janice's drawers. Or when Katie finds Samantha's "It's like a drug" journal entry in the servants' quarters in the basement, the only journal entry Samantha has written without voiceover from Sarah Grayson for obvious reasons. The gamer only has a few seconds to read the note before Katie refuses to read it, and the game won't allow you to read the rest. Unless, of course, you're that curious to read the rest, you dirty perverts. At first playthrough, you assume it's because, well, it's an entry about Samantha's first time having sex, too much TMI for Katie to handle. However, despite us having read and heard plenty of Samantha's journal entries, this is Katie saying that this entry is too personal because it is too intimate of a moment for Samantha to share with anyone else, something Katie is mindful of. Yes, I realize there's a twist to Katie reading all of the journal entries towards the end, but I'll bring it up when we get to Sam's chapter. Another hint as to how the game might give Katie some empathy for her younger sister is the journal entry "The Nunnery," in which Sam, in a state of anxiety, recalls their father joking about sending Katie to a nunnery after she would bring boys home to their house, forcing Sam to ask what would happen if her parents found out about her sexual orientation and her relationship with Lonnie.
You know how mom and dad are. Not exactly super open-minded about things. It feels like every minute I don't spend with Lonnie, I spend worrying about them finding out about us. And what would happen if they did? You know Dad's joke about the nunnery that he'd tell whenever he brought boys around the old house? I wonder where he'd want to send me.
When reading and replaying journal entries for this essay, I think the goal in having the audience read and hear the entries from Katie's perspective is to create empathy for Sam, or to apply this in real life. What would happen if a sibling or best friend or cousin was having a same-sex relationship and was too afraid to come out to their family out of fear of being ostracized or kicked out of their home or ghosted by their loved ones? So while there are issues with the development and limited interactivity with Katie as a main character in Gone Home, and even if the game has to be played in the shoes of an assumed cis straight woman despite the LGBTQ+ themes, I can understand why the makers gave the playable character role to Katie as opposed to Sam, because since the majority of gamers going into a game might not fall into a marginalized group, the intention from my perspective is to force gamers to consider their own biases and prejudices. Would you be accepting and still love your gay, trans, or bi brother, sister, sibling, or friend? Or would you cut them off from life, even after all of the good times and memories together? That, I think, is a reoccurring question that a game like Gone Home wants you to answer. Change up the situation a bit, apply to today's times in all of the culture war hysteria, and imagine if your loved one was struggling to come out as transgender to their family due to constant transphobia being spewed all across media. We will start this chapter off by talking about Katie and Sam's mother, Janice. Elizabeth Connolly Greenbrier is another character in the Gone Home universe who, like Katie, is not really that compelling or well developed. Maybe even to a lesser degree than Katie, which is ironic considering this is a mostly female-led game involving a woman discovering her true self. And if you take a step back, you can see how this would also play into Janice as a character were it not for how she is in the actual game. Originally born in Canada in 1950, according to her citizenship certification in the basement, Janice married her husband Terrence Terry Greenbrier in 1972, having Katie in 1973 and Sam 3 years later. Janice worked as a senior conservationist for the State Forestry Service at the Flintlock Forestry Station when the family was living in Forest Grove, Oregon before moving to Boone County, and according to the ID card in the foyer closet, it says she's now at the Tacoma County Forestry Station. During their first year living in the new house, the marriage between Janice and Terry began to go downhill, probably by Terry being upset over his novels no longer being published and his writing taking a turn for the worse. Or maybe something else he's not saying. At her job as a conservationist at the State Forestry Service, she assists in a controlled burn according to an article found upstairs. But during that burn, she ends up meeting Richard Rick Pattermach, who is brought in as assistants during the controlled burn. According to Richard's performance evaluation found in the sitting room upstairs next to the attic, in which she gives him perfect scores across the board, she uses her position to recommend and submit paperwork requesting Rick's permanent transfer to her unit, and thus, the affair is more or less confirmed. Rick gives Janice a copy of Leaves of Grass, a collection of poetry by Walt Whitman according to a bookmark found under her and Terry's bed. He gets her tickets to go see Earth, Wind and Fire, which you can see a poster of in the bedroom along with a ticket to the East Wing on the first floor, and if you come across the sewing room next to the sitting room upstairs, there's even a copy of a fictitious corny romance novel written by Opal LaRousse entitled Wildfires with the tagline, "He saved her from the raging flames," and then things really heated up. An obvious parody of those romance books with hilarious cover art on the front of them. Think like Fabio was on some of them bare-chested. Sidebar, Wildfire sounds like a bizarre prequel idea for Firewatch, I guess. Other than that funny bit, Janice's arc seems very much like an unsatisfied wife arc. Stuck in a marriage she might be having some second thoughts about 20 plus years after committing her vow to Terry, then finding some temporary comfort with Rick at work, and after some affair doing, eventually she's found out, probably because she, like everyone else in the house, left items lying around for Katie to find, and perhaps Terry deduced the truth about Janice and Rick before Katie came home. Or maybe she had second thoughts and she confessed to the affair during the couple's retreat. There's a moment written in an exchange between Sam and Lonnie where Sam apologizes for her mom yelling at Lonnie after she came home from forestry work. But this was written before Sam got in trouble at school and her relationship with Lonnie was discovered, so why take her anger out on a stranger? Obviously, she's fueled by her frustration with coming home to Terry and losing time that would have been spent with Rick. So then why does she presumably stick with Terry at the end of the game? In order for the game to fully justify Janice doing this, we have to talk about the man, her actual man, himself. Terry Greenbrier, aka the world's most famous Elliot Gould lookalike, was born in 1951, and when he is not suffering from writer's block,
oh, my writer's block!
He is a writer, specifically a freelance technology review writer, having been recommended to work for Hi-Fi Aficionado magazine by his friend and college roommate Mike in 1978. But before pursuing freelance writing work, he had his sights on being a novelist and a writer, just like his father, Richard Greenbrier, a professor at the University of Oregon, who had written a book on the literature of James Joyce. Terry aspired to become a writer just like his father and has written 2 books, The Accidental Savior and its sequel, The Accidental Pariah. Both books being fictitious sci-fi thriller works featuring protagonist John Russell, and both involving time travel, and Russell attempting to save the late President John F. Kennedy and stop the Kennedy assassination. But due to poor sales of the first book, as well as even less sales from the second, he is dropped by his publisher Mercury Books and his fiction writing comes to a pause, despite his publisher putting out the sequel out of sympathy. You can see in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet in the greenhouse an unpublished manuscript for The Accidental Human, which was meant to be the 3rd book in the John Russell series, along with finding another manuscript for The Accidental Warrior in the dining room, with a handwritten note of support presumably from Janice, one of the only times we see her supporting her husband before the affair, I assume. However, the biggest blow to Terry's writing career comes from his father, Richard. Terry, who had wanted to be a writer, just like his dad, sends him a copy of his first book, and Richard sends a letter congratulating his son on getting his first book published. But although he says that an author's first published manuscript is a momentous occasion, and that he recognized his son in the subject matter, Richard criticizes his own son's work as being clouded by genre cliches and implausible dime store science fictional deus machina, with the last line of the letter stating, "You can do better," which coincidentally is posted on the board in front of Terry's typewriter in his office upstairs. 4 posted notes for 4 words, and also, when exploring part of the basement floor next to the book featuring Richard's letter on the back, you find a portrait of Professor Richard Greenbrier, defaced probably by his own son, maybe as a reaction to that letter, but there might be another reason for it. Come decades later, Terry is contacted by a publishing company called Unknown Dimension, based in Newark, New Jersey. Which wants to reprint his 2 novels, but judging by their letter, they seem to be too comfortable with reprinting cult science fiction while wearing high-quality tinfoil hats. Compare the exchange between the new publisher and Terry to the way Mercury Books broke off their publishing relationship in a professional manner. There is, of course, the possibility that Terry might be exploited by this new publisher in some way. The fact that Terry is currently feeling vulnerable and down when it comes to his writing and moving into the new house, and thus he might be prone to getting fixated on conspiracies. As Katie is investigating around Terry's office, we can see in front of his typewriter at his desk that not only does Terry seem particularly invested in the Kennedy assassination to an unhealthy degree, with post-it notes spread all over his board as well as post-it note copies for research at his desk in the greenhouse, but this doesn't really help with his writer's block.
Oh, my writer's block!
Struggling to keep going with his novel writing as well as his technical reviews, with an unfinished review sitting on his typewriter as well as having been mailed a complaint from his editor regarding his latest reviews and their word counts, pleading for him to focus less on childhood memories. Which leads us to discussing Terry's childhood and how inheriting the Manson mansion becomes a ghost story of sorts. As previously mentioned in my first review, and as one of the most popular internet theories regarding Gone Home, it is strongly strongly implied, through several items and objects examined around the house, that Terry was molested by the previous owner of the house, Oscar Manson, the owner of Manson's Pharmacy on Main Street in town. While the creators of Gone Home have never said anything about this theory, and while they don't outright confirm it in the game's commentary, we can deduce that this may have been the case according to several clues. For example, in a 1959 newspaper clipping found in the basement with the headline, "Manson's Pharmacy Soda Fountain Welcomes Boone County Youngsters," Terry was described as being Oscar Manson's favorite nephew. In the servant quarters by Oscar's safe with the house outlined to its right, there is a height chart with Terry's name and age on it, beginning with age 6 to age 12, the year being 1963. Creepy enough, there's a small room to the safe's left with no working light which you can't pull and turn on, and apart from a few blocks of chimney wood, you find one wooden horse toy. Yeah, I think you might picture what could have happened there. And 2 years later in 1965, Oscar would end up selling the pharmacy for as little as $1. And wouldn't you know it, the year 1963 just so happens to not only be the year when the Kennedy assassination occurred, but it is also the code to enter Oscar's safe, where you'll find his old syringes and morphine, as well as a letter to Oscar's sister, which was sent back to him. I don't know who put the safe code in like that, either Oscar or Terry, but going to such a dark avenue in a subtle manner, without having to spell it out to gamers, creates an understanding as to why Terry is so depressed after arriving to the new house. In other words, while Gone Home might be guilty of making the whole haunted house aesthetic a red herring, as well as Sam's ghost hunt with Lonnie not leading to too much, for Terry, however, revisiting his uncle's mansion and now inheriting it affects his writing, as well as bringing up an old ghost of his past. Something he probably has a difficult time trying to explain to Janice, given that the marriage crumbles after they've moved into the new house, and a memory he may have to revisit and explain during the retreat when Katie comes back home. Also, going back to his father, did Richard Greenbrier know about this? Is this why Terry defaced his face on that portrait? Anyway, Sam and Katie's interactions with their parents prior to the game seem to be the typical kids growing up scenario. And of course, them leaving all the lights on in the house is something you probably chuckled at, as it's very meta while playing the game. Eventually, however, after a period when Sam starts to misbehave in high school, handing out explicit Riot Girl zines, and her grades flunking, and Terry and Janice finding out about Sam and Lonnie's relationship, rather than flip out, they refuse to believe it, though they do ground her for a month and then after that time forbid her from having Lonnie over with her bedroom door closed. In the back of my mind, and keeping in line with this molestation theory with Oscar and Terry, I read Terry's disbelief and reacted to Sam as him having to revisit his past trauma and to deny it happening, as it was an example of same-sex abuse, and that through his writing he could write out of his trauma somehow, and also erase the possibility his daughter might have same-sex feelings, though in her case, her sexual interactions are consensual. Afterwards, Terry and Janice go away for a week, leaving Sam $40 for pizza, though not explaining the real reason why they're away, which gives Sam and Lonnie enough time to plan out their departure for their new lives. And here is where another problem emerges with the conclusion of Gone Home. Terry and Janice having the best possible outcome in terms of their marriage. Instead of going to Rick's wedding during the week that Katie arrives home, Terry and Janice go to the couples retreat to work on repairing their marriage. Thusly, Terry and Janice have a happily ever after ending to their marriage. But even if they are satisfied with the state of their improving marriage, what about their relationship with Sam? Again, Sam says that rather than get angry or disappointed with them finding out about Sam and Lonnie's relationship. They are in disbelief, like they can't accept that unlike Katie, Sam doesn't have heterosexual feelings, that is just a phase. If the game were to go into an even darker path, or if it may have had multiple endings, given how Terry and Janice try to be as religious as possible with the Bibles lying around the house, despite their hypocrisy with Terry hiding his Playboy-inspired magazine under copies of his books, and Janice and her affair with Rick, compared to Sam's white Bible collecting dust in her closet. And yes, I can see the symbolism there. How could our sweet, sweet Sam be gay? Why not have them propose sending her to a gay conversion therapy camp? Of course, this would be an extreme avenue for the game to go through, but it probably would have raised the stakes for Katie to check if Sam is okay. Then again, I guess this avenue would have reeked of "but I'm a cheerleader" vibes, and though Gone Home doesn't really have a comedic vibe to it like that film, the gay conversion therapy idea would be in line with the horror aesthetic that the game appears to be, despite the game subverting the horror expectations for casual gamers going in. I also got a minor issue with the way Terry's writer's block plays out and how he deals with it that I don't think anyone else has pointed out elsewhere on the internet. In Terry and Janice's closet, you as Katie find a copy of a watercolor technique book, which explains the floral painting found in the sitting room. But Terry isn't the one painting the picture. That would be Janice. So maybe like if Terry wanted to work out his writer's block and his difficulty trying to put out a decent novel, why not just let it be Terry trying to figure out his creativity through painting? That way it would be a eureka moment for him and he would be able to have a few more completed manuscripts for his new publisher to print out. So overall, while Janice is not as well developed as I would have liked her to be, and despite them not giving a parallel between Janice trying to figure herself out with her daughter Sam, Terry is deep and thorough enough of a character that I thought it was worthwhile to really dive into and see how this man came to be who he is before the game starts. Finally, we have what I consider to not only be the game's actual central character, and the one who the gamer gets to know more about through her journal entries, but the undisputed best character in the game, that being Samantha Sam Greenbriar. And holy hell, the game development team really nailed painting and conceiving this character, and letting her story play out through her journal, as Sarah Grayson voices over each entry. I could just end the chapter right then and there, since Sam is the most in-depth character out of the 4 Greenbriar family members, but since the main objective involves finding out the whereabouts of Katie's younger sister, I'm going to try to pick apart and explain her early childhood, how it shaped her sexual orientation, and her relationship, near fallout, and conclusion with Lonnie. As stated earlier, Sam was born 3 years after Katie, and is still with her parents while her older sister is in Europe, as they move into the inherited Manson mansion. Sam did not have many friends as a child, but she was a gamer when she was younger, presumably playing a Super Nintendo console based on the cartridges you find in her room, and she had borrowed some games from her childhood friend and boy next door, Daniel. Although the friend part of that needs an asterisk. You know how some of you may have been growing up maybe in a different house and neighborhood than now, and maybe your parents forced you to be friends with people you may or may not wanted to be friends with? Yeah, that was Sam's friendship with Daniel, a default friend of sorts. At a certain point, according to the journal entry, aptly named Default Friends, Sam got tired of Daniel as he was getting weirder over the years. Thus, moving away means they don't have to see each other. Yet, Sam has use of him because of his Nintendo games and considers giving him a call soon. They do eventually see each other again, years later, as described in the journal entry, again appropriately named Daniel. Daniel comes over the new house to collect the Nintendo game, and he also brings with him a short story that Sam wrote when she was 9 years old, and gives it to her, who reads it and cries. She realizes that throughout her childhood, she had taken her friendship with Daniel for granted, but she's unable to say this to him, and instead explains her situation with her parents, her school, and Lonnie, and then apologizes to him for not being friends anymore. To which Daniel comforts her, telling her that it's going to be okay, despite her skepticism. So while it's not clear what exactly stopped their relationship, seeing as how him being weird is not defined clearly, did he develop feelings for her? Was he harassing her? Was he doing boy stuff? What? It was nice to see that Sam was able to bring closure to a relationship she thought was broken through her own writing. And that leads me to discussing Sam and her writing. Sam, like her father Terry and her grandfather Richard, aspires to be a writer, and like her father and his time-traveling JKF fiction, she uses her writing skills to channel what she subconsciously feels. Obviously, there's the journal entries, which could take up a short novella, and where she is at her most honest place, but that's non-fiction and mostly for therapeutic reasons and to communicate to Katie in a way that she couldn't do in person. But then there's her fictional writings. As a kid, Sam started to write her own fiction, creating the characters Captain Allegra and her first mate to tell her own story. When exploring the house, you find in one of the hidden compartments a manuscript Sam wrote when she was in 9th grade entitled Heaven at the Edge of the World, which involves Allegra's first mate transforming from a man into a woman, and the captain seems okay with this, declaring that she's the love of her life. I don't know if there was a way to read that from a trans perspective, but we can see early on, even before she had met Lonnie, Sam was writing about a same-sex relationship without realizing she herself was gay. And then there's Lonnie. When Sam moves into the Manson mansion, she struggles to make new friends, and she's bullied for living in the Psycho house, as indicated by a crumbled note you find early on in the game. Until one day, she notices Yolanda DeSoto, aka Lonnie, a senior at high school who hangs out at the local 7-Eleven playing the Street Fighter arcade. In the journal entry Best Laid Plans, after 2 weeks of practicing the game at home and learning some special moves, she worked up the courage to take on, aka meet, Lonnie and her friends. Despite it not going well for Sam at the arcade, Lonnie would go on to ask her if she's that Psycho House girl. Rather than mock her and break her heart, Lonnie says she always wanted to see the Psycho House, and Sam invites her over to see the Manson mansion the very next day. At first they start out as friends, but over time their relationship grows into something more. Sam and Lonnie engage in a bit of ghost hunting, with them writing out their ghost detective work, them using an Ouija board to communicate with Sam's dead granduncle Oscar, and the secret room in the foyer holds a worship of sorts, with Oscar's portrait and name tag calling to summon him. Of course, if you recall from the last chapter, while Gone Home plays in misdirection as the game really isn't a supernatural ghost story, the actual ghost story does involve Oscar, but it's actually less about Sam and more about how Terry deals with the ghost of his childhood, which Sam, to our knowledge, has no idea about and hasn't pieced out those dark details about her father. As Sam and Lonnie get to know each other more, we learn that Lonnie comes from a socially conservative military family, as Sam sees her wearing an army suit sometimes at school, as shown in a photograph found on the first floor, and Lonnie's mom, who lives in Florida, is somehow even more unbearable for Lonnie than Janice is for Sam. Though Sam gets closer to Lonnie, she is not without her hesitation, seeing as how she didn't really grow up with many friends apart from Daniel. Nevertheless, Lonnie becomes the first real person she can open up to, and in another example of the game's misdirection, one which would have taken the game to a much darker path, Lonnie asks Sam to dye her hair red in the bathtub upstairs, which Sam realizes is a really intimate moment for her, though the entry about it would have taken place earlier than what we see when Katie arrives to explore, which of course looks like someone tried to cut themselves without the proper context. Sam and Lonnie would later, after some hesitation, share their first kiss a little after attending a concert, though due to the social atmosphere and the fear of their parents finding out, they keep their relationship a secret, despite their high school peers likely aware of their relationship. Sam receives a brochure regarding a summer writing program at Reed College and invites Lonnie over to stay at her dorm, but Lonnie, being part of a military family, tells her she starts basic training after graduation. For Sam, Lonnie is a walking contradiction. As the singer in her friend's band, Lonnie puts on an anti-authority appearance, dyeing her hair red, handing out feminist zines, and playing Riot Girl punk music. Yet she wants to join the military, which to me raises a number of issues like, I know this is not a post-9/11 story, but is Lonnie even aware of who benefits from the ever-increasing military-industrial complex and all the raises and spending on the Department of Defense? Also, during this time, and just like Doma, and as Sam writes down, the Clinton administration passed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which barred discrimination against gay, lesbian, and bisexual soldiers, but also barred openly gay, lesbian, and bisexual soldiers from serving, which means that she would have to lie about her sexual orientation. Regardless, rather than break things off then, they agree to spend as much time together as possible before Lonnie ships off to training, and closer they become. However, as much as Lonnie has brought out some of the best in Sam, from her parents' perspective, Lonnie has only brought out the worst in their daughter. Sam's grades start to go down in school, and she and Lonnie get into trouble after they get separated from their field trip group while visiting Multnomah Falls and getting lost, or lost in quotation marks, it's not clear if they were just digging around. which results in Sam's parents getting a call from the school, and their reaction is, well, she never acted like this until she met Lonnie. Sam and her parents finally have a conversation about not only her behavior at school, but the truth about her relationship with Lonnie. Sam is honest and admits it's romantic, but as discussed in the parents chapter, rather than get upset or furious with their daughter, they deny it, telling her that she hasn't met the right guy yet and that it's just a phase. Despite getting grounded for a month, Sam is surprised by their reaction, but nonetheless, as she puts it, they're in for a very long phase. A few days before the game's events, her parents go away to a couples retreat to celebrate their anniversary. Unaware that this trip is really about repairing their relationship, Sam spends that time going to one of Lonnie's shows with her band, and in one of the most impactful journal entries, Dedication,
Then she dedicated the last song to me. I couldn't take it. I was out on the curb in the alley, sobbing till my ribs hurt. After a long time, she found me. She said she was sorry. She said, I wish things could be different. I just wanted to make you happy. I said, I don't think you can anymore.
They agree to spend one last night with each other in the Manson mansion, getting in contact with Oscar and hanging out in the attic, spreading photographs of each other all around, and after looking at them, both realize that they'll never have new memories together, which makes them both cry, and they spend that night in each other's arms. But by the next morning, Sam wakes up to no Lonnie in the house. Depressed, she spends that next day by herself in the attic, realizing that she'll have to move on without her partner. Until...
Sam, where are you? Really? I need to talk to you. Please be there.
Sam barely makes it to the phone when Lonnie tries again, the third time being the charm, and Lonnie tells Sam that she got off the bus on the way to army training, and tells her to pack everything she can and drive somewhere where they can make a new life together, to which she says yes. By the time Katie has arrived to the Manson mansion, Sam has already left, and this is where the sort of twist comes in. Katie hasn't been reading the actual journal entries while exploring. Rather, she read all of the journal entries in the Letters to Katie notebook in the attic after she has already explored the whole house. In the first page, Sam apologizes to Katie for not being there to explain fully why she left, but she promises that they will see each other again, someday. Sidebar. However, a blogger proposed an alternate ending in which the player never gets to reading the I Said Yes journal entry, and once you get to the Letters to Katie notebook, the last lines of dialogue from Sam read less like a see you later and more like a suicide note, which is a theory I don't buy. Based on the authorial intention from the game's makers, Sam, like her parents, is meant to have the best possible ending. And really, if this ending were true, it would just be that Katie is ignorant of the full details of Sam's whereabouts, which she kinda is. And even so, Sam still says she'll see her sister again. Yet this is clearly not in a religious sense, since Sam gives no indication she's religious, so no, I think that this is just a dead-end theory, like the red dye in the bathtub, but regardless. So, even after I have gone through Sam's story and some of her journal entries, I feel like I have only scratched the surface as to how beautiful her story with Lonnie plays out. From their first interaction, their first kiss, their fallout and reunion, it's almost 90s movie Pitch Perfect. Sam clearly trusts and loves her older sister, given how much information she shares with Katie, in contrast to how she deals with her parents, how some of the postcards read, and the way Samantha addresses Katie in her journal entries. Clearly, for better or worse, the game is less about Katie and more about Sam, and putting aside the basic gameplay mechanics and graphics for a moment, their relationship is the most drawn out aspect of what got gamers hooked on to Gone Home. Unfortunately, while Sam and Terry stand out as the most well-developed characters in Gone Home with each of their qualities and faults, the lesser density of Katie and Janice drag the family story. Maybe if Sam were the main character and Katie was just a side character, this truly would have been Sam's story, but alas, it is not, and now that we've looked into the characters as a way to examine the scope of this rather mundane love story, it is time to address what really makes this game not fully work now compared to a decade ago. Have you ever read a book, watched a film, listened to a record, or played a video game and say to yourself afterwards, that was interesting, but I feel like there should have been much more to this? That was the biggest thought in my mind when I contemplated how I felt about Gone Home, even more so now than my initial review of this game years ago, that the scope of the game is too small precisely because the subversion of the quote-unquote haunted house is really about an ordinary high school romance, albeit it's a same-sex one. I can understand that telling such a relatively mundane love story like the one here could present an opportunity for some marginalized gamers to relate in a way that a gamer like myself can't. After all, if you've never faced homophobia, how can you even attempt to articulate any criticism when you've been privileged enough not to face such bigotry? Well, this comes back to the point of the game creating empathy as a pathway to acceptance. Going back to this goal and attempting to give the players empathy for the characters in the game, in our video essay on Gone Home, YouTuber Screen Therapy addressed how limiting the scope of the game to a single family allows the gamer, as Katie, to empathize with not just Samantha, but also Terry and Janice. Now, speaking as a straight man, I can empathize by how Terry and Janice got to where they were, yet I am still irritated by the fact that they haven't even accepted Sam for who she is and her relationship with Lonnie. However, there's a chance that gay and lesbian gamers would not feel the same way, that they could never understand why Terry and Janice, and for that matter, their own real parents, could not accept them, even after years of taking care of them and loving them. As I was playing, there were indications that they can get by without Sam at all. The fact that Terry is going off the deep end with JFK conspiracies in his writings, the marriage advice book in her parents' bathroom is by a reverend, and the fact that Terry and Janice are a lot more religious than Sam are indications that Terry and Janice are a lot more religious than Sam, according to the number of Bibles they have in the house. In the worst case scenario, though not outright said, Sam's parents may have become more fundamentalist in their religious practice. But still, I understand the scope of the game being small, allowing you, the gamer, to learn, understand, and empathize with what Sam is going through, and how she's able to make a new life for herself. However, I think I and other gamers have focused too much on the scope of the game, that we forget about one major issue: the stakes at play here. And there's a difference between the scope of a game and the stakes of a game. Let me explain. To address the distinction between the scope versus the stakes in a game, if you were to ask me what makes a game exciting, I would ask, what are the stakes should I fail to finish a given game? What are the stakes if I don't go through Hollow Nest in Hollow Knight, fight off the Flood in Halo 1, or find out what Black Mesa was up to in Half-Life, to give a few examples? Of course, there aren't any stakes in winning, say, Sudoku or Tetris, unless your brain needs the mental workout. But a game where a universe is in trouble, an evil force arrives and you have to stop it, or you find yourself trapped and you have to get out, then the stakes can vary from personal to a broader societal conflict. But when it comes to talking about the stakes in walking simulators, well, we have to first ask, what qualifies as a walking simulator and what does not? And according to our definition of a walking simulator, what should be the stakes of such a game? I think anyone can make the distinction between your basic adventure game and a walking simulator game, which is a subgenre of adventure games since you may be given a task or objective to complete. But it's not always the case that games involving walking aren't necessarily meant to simulate walking, or if it's the selling point. Sure, top budget games like, say, older games in the Grand Theft Auto series to newer titles like Cyberpunk 2077, while more objective intensive as these are action games, will involve a lot of traveling, including walking even while in third person, yet hardly anyone would put them in the same category as other walking simulators, since walking simulators are predominantly first person. And in some cases like Gone Home, there's no run option. A small little indie game like A Short Hike, where there aren't really stakes even while trying to get to the top of the mountain, is exploration intensive, but without any major stakes, it's clearly a casual experience as a third-person walking simulator like Gone Home. One of my favorite recent games, Night in the Woods, while having a larger mystery going on in Possum Springs, aka there are stakes for the town in finding out the answer to that mystery, it still involves walking around town and interacting with some of the buildings and citizens from a third-person perspective. Even Nintendo's Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom involve a great degree of exploration, i.e. casually walking or running around Kakariko or Hateno Village to get items or armor, or walking through paths that get to a certain point or place of interest if not on horseback, master cycle, or whatever invention your Ultra Hands can come up with. But even here, you're not really thinking about the feeling of walking. You're thinking, how long is it going to take me to beat Ganon to save Hyrule? And thus, the stakes in these games are larger. Again though, these aren't defined as walking simulators, but at times can make for some easy breezy casual gameplay when you're not invested in clearing an objective. But what about older titles like Myst, The Seventh Guest, or Return to Zork? Games which feel like ancient point-and-click titles you might have played on your dad's computer. Yet you can see the influence they have had on modern walking simulators, along with having some similarities with Gone Home. Well, again, the difference is stakes. In the puzzle-intensive adventure game, The Seventh Guest, you're exploring a haunted mansion and learning about the mystery behind the whereabouts of the attending guests in the house along with the builder and owner of the house, Henry Staff, and there are sad elements to this story along with a twist as to who the playable character is. And yet the stakes here is that you have to find out who really is this boy wandering around and safe. See also the bizarre world of Return to Zork, where the creators were clearly fucking around with this rather contemporary world that in part created for shits and giggles, and yet you still have to save the game's world from a dark force that has decayed the surroundings. Thusly, there are stakes. So in more ways than you think, the stakes, or lack thereof, of Gone Home don't resemble The Seventh Guest or Return to Zork. No, in a particular way, Gone Home is more like Myst, the classic 1993 adventure game and at one point best-selling game of all time, in which the player travels to the mysterious island called, well, Myst, and not only does the gamer have to solve complex puzzles, but as the gamer advances, he or she learns more about the island and history through exploration and has to make choices here and there, including whether to save certain people to advance to achieve one of the game's multiple endings. And just like Gone Home, there's no major risk for you the gamer in Myst, as the player doesn't die in the universe. And just like Gone Home, Myst is purely exploration intensive, except on a larger scale in comparison to the one house in Gone Home. And just like Gone Home, you can go about the island in multiple ways. And I think the ability to explore freely in Myst and Gone Home, among other games and walking simulators, is why that Shigeru Miyamoto quote from the beginning of this essay is so relevant to this discussion on the ability, or maybe the illusion, of freedom in video games. While games will typically follow a linear path and there's almost always an endpoint to complete the quest, that feeling of control, like you're the director, is what attracts people to certain games. Non-fans of Gone Home may try to shortcut or speedrun the game, but in the end, the whole journey, with the story, the surroundings, the environment, and people taking their place in the journey, is more fascinating as a whole than the quickest path. It's like reading any book in A Song of Ice and Fire, getting to know the history and people of Westeros through thousands of pages, and then sighing when that TV show shortcuts all the little details. Gone Home, at its best, works as an interactive novel. Even if it's not the best playable game, there's always a conclusion, but how you get to that conclusion is for the player to decide. Do you check upstairs first and wander for hours if there's any secret door, or do you start with the first floor? That feeling of freedom, along with the LGBTQ+ depiction, is probably what attracted some gamers to Gone Home. So with all that said, I think the biggest problem Gone Home has is that in the grand scheme of things, the stakes in this game are very small. Or you could say there are no stakes, at least for Katie. As I have brought up a few times, the game's ending is quite possibly the best outcome for the Greenbrier family. Thusly, the stakes are hardly there by the time you find your way into the attic. Sam has gone away with Lonnie to seek a better life. Terry and Janice are working on repairing their marriage, and presumably, Katie is happy that Sam is finding happiness elsewhere, and she will probably see her again in the not-too-distant future. Hell, even the Christmas duck gets a happy ending. So you could say that at least hardly anyone got hurt in the process. But the happy ending comes with a flip side. Terry and Janice may be healing their relationship, and they'll see Katie sooner or later after their retreat, but we'll never know how they'll react to Sam's departure, whether or not Katie chooses to tell her parents about her whereabouts, or if they will ever accept Sam for who she is. And nobody needed to be saved or for the gamer to be assured that Sam's okay because, well, Sam saved herself from having to lie about who she is. Sam gets the girl of her dreams in Lonnie, and they don't have to deal with the hardship in dealing with difficult parents. Conversely, if this game went a darker path, and Sam's life was at risk if her parents tried to correct her same-sex feelings instead of just denying them, or to incorporate the house into this, and turn this game into a horror game, maybe including a few challenging puzzles around the house like its predecessors, well, yeah, there would be more stakes even if the ending was the same. But all of this is in relation to the game's universe. In reality, not every gay or trans person will have such a happy ending, and what's worse, despite the intention behind encouraging empathy to the players, we're living in times where the LGBTQ+ community is still dealing with outright bigotry, on a legislative level and even from parts of the gaming community, and in media corners as well. Which is why it is now time to address the unforeseen consequences that have plagued any attempt to try to examine this game in a fair and open light. And boy, you could say this next chapter could fill a whole room. Well, there's really two elephants in the room to discuss here. Firstly, in the year following the release of Gone Home, the broader gaming community, the industry, and the press saw the movement called Gamergate emerge out of a Twitter hashtag into internet activism, despite accusations that the campaign was engaging in harassment and death threats towards certain journalists, developers, and critics, most notably women. Now, Gamergate is an extremely confusing and frustrating internet phenomenon to try and dissect, remember, and explain. Like, I'm trying to explain all of this while not acting like an old man sitting on a rocking chair on a front porch recollecting a wartime story frustrating. On the one hand, the proponents of the so-called Gamergate movement argued that the gaming industry was littered with corruption and collusion, specifically in the gaming press and games journalism, i.e. journalists and reporters would do favors for game developers, especially those in the indie game scene. In other words, the movement didn't care whether or not you were left-wing, centrist, or right-wing, and those involved in Gamergate simply wanted gaming journalists to be more ethical. And really, being an ethical journalist is not really a problem. On the other hand, though, and from where I sit years later, their corruption in gaming narrative was, shall we say, narrow. And what's worse, the whole ethics in journalism angle was simply a ruse, a Trojan horse, a red herring, to groom people into a hate campaign, as this Input article explains. Quote, the Gamergate debacle is largely considered one of the biggest influences for today's spread of misinformation, unhinged online conspiracy movements, and right-wing reactionary trends. It started within cesspools like 4chan under the ridiculous pretense of fighting back against encroaching PC culture within the video game industry. And Gamergate supporters quickly devolved their campaign into all-out harassment on a number of female video gaming journalists and developers in hopes of intimidating them into silence. And speaking of right-wing reactionary trends, despite claims that the Gamergate movement was center-left, some of the loudest supporters and advocates of Gamergate were, in fact, blatantly right-wing, including ex-Breitbart writer and self-hating gay man Milo Yiannopoulos, who actually converted from being gay to straight, Pizzagator Mike Sternovich, and failed UKIP politician and stepfather Carl Gunn of Swindon, aka Carl Benjamin. In fact, there's an argument to be made that Gamergate itself was a gateway for some supporters of the movement to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. So why bring this up when Gamergate hasn't held up as a campaign for ethics in journalism? Well, one of the games targeted by Gamergate for its themes and press coverage before and after release was Gone Home. Specifically, those in Gamergate who claim to care about corruption and collusion in games journalism argue that certain journalists who cover the game did not disclose personal and/or friendly ties with members of the production team, and also some disingenuous debate as to whether or not Gone Home could be considered a game, which I already kinda explained it is, actually, in the last chapter. Now, strictly speaking, objectively, without trying to cringe here, I can kinda see why it's important for journalists to disclose personal connections. After all, unlike, say, political journalism, which has years and years of operation and where corporate news outlets can be guilty of manufacturing consent on certain issues, gaming journalism is a relatively recent avenue, and thus it's possible that there could be loopholes in the way journalists cover issues. Obviously, sure, disclosure of relationships is one thing, but is omitting this information really the biggest crime in gaming journalism? And even if we're talking what is and what isn't ethical in gaming journalism, and more broadly, journalism in general, it's indie gaming, an avenue in the games industry which is already financially kneecapped and where game developers have to rely on Kickstarters to get necessary funding to get production on the roll. Of course, Kickstarter is responsible for some games getting funding, and to see such games become bigger than funders would have thought, case in point, obviously Hollow Knight. But really, is not disclosing a relationship with someone in a studio a bigger scandal in gaming than, say, most game studios actively opposing unionizing despite increasing support from games developers? Or the Call of Duty franchise having close ties with the Department of Defense, which seems like a giant red flag given how many bases America has around the world? See, this is the problem with trying to assess the movement almost a decade later. That it becomes clear that the problem Gamergate had with Gone Home was less about the actual game, the mechanics, the story, the dialogue, the graphics, and so on, and more about how the game prominently highlights a same-sex relationship, however mundane it may be for some gamers. In other words, Gone Home is a story that was small in scale, yet in the bigger picture, it highlighted society's shifting acceptance towards the LGBTQ+ community, which the right wing pounce under the guise of ethics. For a more in-depth and thorough analysis of the roots and ideological motivations behind Gamergate, Canadian YouTuber Dan Olsen posted a video back in 2014 on his Folding Ideas channel, but he summarizes the Gamergate movement as nothing more than the new name for a long-standing resistance to the increased visibility of minority voices in society at large. So to summarize, does corruption happen in the games industry, and should journalists disclose any personal relationships? Yes, and we can go on all day pointing to examples here and there. But was Gamergate the single most important thing to curb stomp corruption in the gaming world? And did it have any lasting impact besides making some women and minority voices uncomfortable with gaming culture due to harassment and sexism? No, and in recent times, most of the corruption and scandals going on in the industry have little to do with games journalism or whether or not games are pushing a narrative, whatever that means, and more as a symptom of the follies of capitalist corruption. Unless, of course, the right wing wants to acknowledge that military games push the narrative that the military-industrial complex is a force for good, but I don't want to spoil all those Call of Duty gamers' Mountain Dew drinks. Whether we are talking microtransactions, hilariously bad and meme-to-death moments like Dorito-gate, or even worse, a journalist getting fired for not giving a game a high score, or say, the difficulty of gaming company employees trying to unionize their workspaces, to gaming company CEOs, video games are really just products meant to be consumed, damned with any in-depth analysis. And that really is what Gamergate was meant to shield from. And further, the idea that a game like Gone Home was somehow pushing an ideology is really just a red herring for supporters of Gamergate to protect their products for consumption. But even if you think Gamergate holds up way less than Gone Home, which I certainly do, given that the movement had relatively little impact on gaming years later, putting aside the harassment and echoes of Gamergate-style politics here and there, the Phantom Menace. And even if you really enjoyed Gone Home or think it's just fine, like I do, I don't think naysayers, fans, and internet trolls and sexists could have predicted what would come years later, and here is where that second elephant comes in. On the 4th of August 2021, roughly 2 years ago, Polygon, one of the gaming journalism outlets who gave high praise to Gone Home, reported that the Fulbright company's co-founder, Steve Gaynor, one of the co-creators of Gone Home, was stepping down from his creative lead role on the upcoming Open Roads game, following multiple allegations of mistreating Fulbright employees, particularly women. Years before the scandal erupted in August of 2017, Fulbright, with more employees after Gone Home's success, released another game, Tacoma, which received a generally positive reception, albeit with fewer copies sold than Gone Home, though just enough copies to continue production on other games and more people working for the company, and more people to employ. And I assume they were planning to release Open Roads next, with actresses Kerry Russell and Caitlin Dever starring. According to the aforementioned Polygon article, multiple former employees alleged that Fulbright's working environment was controlling, a place in which staffers felt undermined and demeaned, constantly micromanaged, and that, quote, the studio's toxic culture hid behind the veneer of inclusivity, as women were allegedly repeatedly broken down by microaggressions. One employee gave an account regarding Fulbright's working environment. Quote, this is going to sound like a joke, but I'm completely serious. Working for him often felt like working for a high school mean girl, one former employee in a leadership position told Polygon. His go-to weapon was to laugh at people's opinions and embarrass them in front of other people. Gaynor responded in a statement after stepping down from his role that his, quote, leadership style was hurtful to people that worked at Fulbright, and for that he truly apologized. Today, Fulbright, which was once soaring in recognition along with the critical acclaim and buzz given the success of Gone Home, is now a one-man operation, with Gaynor riding solo, and Fulbright will not be credited for the upcoming Open Roads game, which is currently being credited by the Open Roads team. So, yeah, not exactly the note I wanted to wrap this section on, but it was important to discuss this new information, as the epilogue post Gone Home's release has not painted one of the key production players in a nice light, albeit this was by his own doing. And just like Night in the Woods, with the controversy involving the game's composer and coder, the feminist and LGBTQ+ themes of Gone Home now have to be viewed by people with the acknowledgement that while marginalized gamers found comfort and healing in the story of Sam and Lonnie, we now have to ask, what's the intention here? And who does this really benefit? Who really feels good playing this game? The marginalized gamers empathizing with Sam and Lonnie, or the straight white guy leading the production team and who's getting positive coverage for making such a feminist-themed, women-led game? Like, when I read into certain aspects of Terry's character and how he treats Sam, like grounding her for a month or not believing her when she's revealed to be a lesbian after she gets punished by her school, I think to myself, is Terry being just as controlling to his own daughter as the guy who helped make this game towards his own female employees? It's not a pleasant question to bring up, but it's one to ask as a straight male gamer when talking about a piece of art as impactful as Gone Home, and not asking it would be dishonest. And of course it goes without saying, if this had happened in, say, 2015 as opposed to 2021, you bet your ass Gamergate would have pounced on this as another example why people shouldn't buy Gone Home. Not because women involved in the game felt threatened or unsafe in their working environment, but because it was another opportunity to dump on a game they already were going to trash anyway because of the game's themes. And in all of this, we lose sight of the fact that despite the positive depiction of women in this game, women in real life will have to go through sexism, even by supposed male allies, as was the case here according to the Polygon article. To wrap things up, at the risk of sounding like a political centrist who is guilty of both sidesism when it comes to important issues, do I think Gone Home is an indie game masterpiece, and has replaying it changed my mind? No, and to the second question, sort of. So then, is Gone Home as bad of a game as some of the harsher critics and anti-gay folks have claimed over the years? Well, no. I can see with more mature and age eyes why the game was appealing and compelling to certain marginalized gamers in the LGBT LGBTQ+ community, and I can see Gone Home's influence here and there in newer games. Again, there's no easy way to say this while trying to be as delicate and sensitive as possible, but not only do I think the game is slightly overrated in comparison to its predecessors and games which came after it, but Gone Home has also proven itself to be one of the most overhated games in gaming history, as it was a good example of a piece of art or entertainment getting reviewed bombed on Steam and Metacritic. However, regardless of whether you like the game or not, in terms of its overall legacy and influence on the indie game scene, Gone Home is not only a game that should have been much better than what the final product shows, but the game is another example of a cautionary tale of indie game success, and any analysis or retrospective on Gone Home now and years later needs to take into account the downfall of Fulbright and how it sheds an uncomfortable light on the game's LGBTQ+ feminist themes. Gone Home might have played a part in the recent success of indie games over AAA game development, like say Firewatch, The Stanley Parable, and What Remains of Edith Finch, but ultimately that's the problem with assessing the game. I can remember moments from games which stick out and make the whole piece of art something worthwhile remembering. Even in past games like the BioShock series, I am still looking at a work of art which is denser than what the cover art shows, and while Gone Home has its obvious influences rooted in immersive works in video games, like BioShock, it plays less like an actual game and more like a short playable novel, sort of like the 1995 short story to video game adaptation of Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. But whereas that decades-old point-and-click adventure horror game had multiple possibilities for the gamer to conclude the story, the single best possible ending of Gone Home for Katie, Terry, Janice, Lonnie, and Sam is already written for the audience, and yet the reader must navigate their way towards an unchangeable conclusion. But as I was wrapping up my gameplay of Gone Home, along with finishing up the script, I was thinking about Sam's final words of dialogue written as you open the Letters to Katie journal, and as the game's title card reappears one last time before the end credits roll. The final song being played is Complicated by Sleater Kinney's Corin Tucker's previous band Heavens to Betsy. Throughout the game, you have probably picked up a cassette tape or two and put the cassette in the player to hear what Sam was hearing as she was on her journey of self-discovery, and to be honest, I think this song is the most appropriate song to conclude this game. It's angry, sad, and time appropriate given it was released in 1994, and what's better is that the lyrics make it all the more just right. If you wanna go, just go, just go, just go, just go. And I'll watch you walk away. I'll die if you go, just go, just go, just go, and I'll watch you walk away. You can interpret part of the chorus in two ways. One, since this represents Katie finishing her story, that being finishing reading the journal after going through the house and finding it in the attic, she's willing to let Sam go despite her sisterly love. Or two, Sam and Lonnie unwilling to let go of each other, with Sam upset at the possibility that Lonnie will leave her for good due to her military commitment. And that's kind of the point. We're guilty of overlooking that the game is telling a more simple, intimate story, that we focus too much on all the trivialities going on in their lives. That in the end, really, they want something more, something deeper, and I think this is what the game was trying to get at, which makes the, no pun intended, complicated legacy of Gone Home all the more worthwhile for fans, haters, and all gamers to dive into, at least for one playthrough. I have said this before in one way or another, so I'll just paraphrase for a moment. You can't view Gone Home or any other game as either a landmark and or a stagnation in gaming. Rather, you should view games like Gone Home as a step in the evolution of game development, and even more so, an attempt to try and communicate something human that went beyond traditional gaming norms, try or fail. Even if you are in the opinion that the game has more negative qualities than positive, or if you prefer another game over this, sometimes the best formula for some games is to get people to think about their lives, what they want, and how they can find ways to fulfill something missing, even in turbulent times like these compared to the 90s, where you need to be someday.
I love you so much, Katie. I'll see you again. Someday. Love, Sam.
Meow, meow. Meow, meow. Meow.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video essay, please comment and like. If you want to see more video essays, please consider subscribing to the Armchair Brain YouTube channel and ring the bell as well to watch discussions on topics in philosophy, art, politics, and video games. Also, please subscribe to my Twitch streaming channel at twitch.tv/armchairbrain to watch me play video games and occasionally discuss other topics for future video essays.